if they thought this was going to work, they would leap at this in an instant.
Florentino Perez, the Real Madrid president, will just not let this Super League idea go, will he? He emphasised his continuing pursuit of it in a speech at Real Madrid's General Assembly last weekend. Miguel, what did you make of it?
Well, it had never gone away because obviously the three clubs, Juventus, Real Madrid and Barcelona, are taking this court case to the European Court of Justice. And the almost first staging post of that is December, where counsel will be given on the hearings in July for some sort of next decision to be made in probably around March, April, about whether these clubs actually have a case that UEFA runs a monopoly that is counter to how business should be run in the EU.
So it's at European Court of Justice level already.
But then on the other side, UEFA's big argument here is that a monopoly is actually necessary because sport has a cultural power, and also they run a kind of a pan-European body. The interesting thing there is there are legitimate arguments against, I mean, as grotesque as the kind of original Super League idea was, there are fair arguments over how UEFA has this kind of dual or almost triple role, where it's kind of the safeguard regulatory body of the game, but also it's actually sort of in competition with some of its own clubs to a degree, because the Champions League is such a massive money-making operation. So one of the key arguments to how whether those should be split, and obviously the big plan for these clubs is ultimately they want to have the freedom to go off and devise their own competitions. So I mean, there's all this swirling around in it. Now, there was a lot in Perez's speech that was kind of bombastic, but he did say one interesting thing where he's talking about kind of the wider issue, and essentially how any new project would not feature fixed members. And I think that could be very significant going forward, especially as regards the court case.
And that's a change, obviously, from the previous argument that they had.
You could argue, Dotton, it's to undercut UEFA's reforms of the Champions League in 2024, which is meant to be almost a more equitable Super League, isn't it? The way it's been put out.
But with no great support, no one really likes it. A problem is no one really understands it.
No.
And I think the key to kind of a competition working is its simplicity.
Porque también ellos han hecho un formato que a nuestro modo de ver no funciona. Vamos, le puedo asegurar que no hay nadie que diga que funcione. Se lo aseguro. He hablado con todas las ligas, con todas las federaciones. Sí. Nadie lo entiende.
Well, that's it. I mean, I think if you go back to UEFA creating the Nations League, which is one of the better things they've done in recent years, it was such a difficulty to get people to get it. And it wasn't... I don't think it was ever a particularly complicated format, but I don't think it was particularly well presented in those terms. It wasn't presented in particularly clear terms. So really, winning the marketing battle for it, I think, is very, very important. But this point that Perez came up with about, sporting dynasties like Nadal and Federer, and, no one says that's boring. Well, I think it's different in the sense that Nadal and Federer are not organisations funded loads more than their competitors.
But also they go
it's no sort of comparison.
But they go through the knockout stages. They take on the lowly tennis players, and sometimes they get knocked out.
Exactly.
In the first round.
Exactly. It's really interesting that this has come up this week with Florentino Perez's comments, and Barcelona are where they are at this point. And that's why, you know how I've always found it a bit curious in the last decade how Dortmund and Bayern, for example, are real rivals on the pitch. Again, it's a sort of like mutually beneficial rivalry, really, a commercially expedient rivalry. But they're total allies off the pitch. What they want to do globally, all their interests align, and it's exactly the same with Real Madrid and Barcelona. And Barcelona,
it's a really interesting point. It's actually been, it hasn't really been people haven't gone into it that strongly yet, but it's really worth raising that regard. And it's amazing how joined at the hip Barcelona, Real, and Madrid are now.
Yeah,
it's actually remarkable, and how much their interests align.
What's been the reaction from the rest of European football to Perez's comments so far?
muted but interested.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say. No one's really willing to break cover at the moment, and everyone is happy to use Real Madrid, Barcelona and Juventus as this sort of Trojan horse. Now, we've said, for the reasons going back to the start with Barcelona and where they are at the moment, why they would welcome that sort of certainty. Juventus, whose whole sporting project is hamstrung by where they are at the moment. And bear in mind that, over the past decade plus, they've been the financially strongest of all the Italian clubs. But they're in a situation at the moment where ideally they would fire their coach, Massimiliano Allegri. They can't, because it's too expensive, and it would further set back their rebuild. But as Miguel says, there are other clubs out there who have overspent, who have got themselves into tricky financial models. And I'm thinking of a club like Atletico Madrid, for example, who are a club who have been incredibly beholden to Champions League money since they got successful, since they moved stadium and got a bigger stadium. If they thought this was going to work, they would leap at this in an instant. And I think there are other clubs like this as well. So they're all waiting for December. They're all waiting for this court case, and they're all waiting to see which way the wind is blowing, because this ruling about there being a UEFA monopoly or otherwise on organising competitions, this is important, not just in terms of the Super League. The Super League is an element of it, but it's the fact that clubs will lead things going forward rather than an independent body that considers sport ahead of, say, the entertainment business.
That's what the argument is essentially about as well. It's whereas the structure of European football, in terms of power block and its institutional structure, basically has the national federations as the basic blocks, with that feeding into UEFA. What the clubs want to do is basically realign it. So the basic unit of power is the clubs themselves.
So it's like a Europe-wide Premier League, basically.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. And on that, I mean, there's all sorts of opinions on how the court case is going to play out. No one knows for certain. I think, at the very least, think there had been a feeling it would be a slam dunk for UEFA. At the moment, no one seems to think that. I wonder whether it'd be some kind of fudge, whether there is some sort of kind of wall put up within UEFA between different disparate bodies, but ultimately to sanction a new competition, you still need UEFA's agreement, which would be kind of a classic kind of solution that really kind of satisfies nobody, but at least kind of allow. Because the other side of it is we potentially football getting into a kind of a dart situation or a cricket situation with disparate kind of bodies and competitions all over the place, which I don't think would be good at all.
Yeah, it's not been good for boxing, has it?
Yeah. No. And again, there's also the inherent question, and whatever the flaws of UEFA, do you want the game driven by just the biggest forces who ultimately, and this has of course been central to the Super League discussion as well, are acting in their own interests? One of the predictions that if the Super League get their way, I think what a lot of people seem to feel will happen is that it will lead to either a competitor to the Champions League or a competitor to the domestic leagues, potentially, I suppose, where it's possibly the three big clubs still driving it: Juventus, Barcelona, Real Madrid, and a lot of those kind of clubs who are essentially too big for the domestic league but not big enough for the Champions League. And you've got a fair tranche of them that are massive European names and would make any such competition quite commercially attractive.
Quite apart from the existential questions as to where, the organising bodies might be left, does UEFA have a defence that will stand up in court?
Well, it's ultimately based on kind of sport as culture. And one of them was also about kind of the closed nature of the Super League. UEFA's defence has basically been predicated on how awful the Super League project has been, whereas the Super League argument has been more about kind of technicalities of law. So it basically depends on the interpretation of the court. And the one thing is these courts tend to be quite political. UEFA have the backing of most of the EU member states, but we'll see how it plays out.